Exodus is really the book about the birth of the nation of Israel. It's the realization of the promise that God made to Abraham, that he would make Abraham the father of nations, specifically one nation in particular. The promised Messiah would come through the loins of Abraham, through Isaac, and through Jacob, and one of Jacob's children, which turns out to be Judah. But it's, if you'll recall, at the end of the book of Genesis, we have Jacob, who has been renamed Israel, and his family moving to Egypt at the behest of Pharaoh and at the behest of Joseph, who is the second person in charge of the nation of Egypt, because that's where God has placed him. So they are welcomed as honored guests. And then we have a 400 and some year period that we just kind of skip over until we get to the Exodus. And the Exodus is the story. It's a story of redemption. It's very prophetic in nature. In other words, what happens to the nation of Israel is what God will do to the entire world, the nations of the world who will believe in his son, through the actions, through similar actions to those that we see in the book of Exodus. It is a book of redemption, but it is also the story of the birth of the nation and the fulfillment of the promise God made to Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12. So we have the family of Israel, Jacob, moving to Egypt and settled in the land of Goshen, in the very best place in the nation of Egypt. They were there as a guest of Pharaoh. And so they prospered, and they grew, and they prospered, and they expanded. They had children, and now they're a large group of people. And I think the question was asked at one point, and I don't recall who asked it. One of you on the call, I think, or somebody who usually joins us. Why did Pharaoh turn against the nation of Israel and make them slaves? And the answer to that lies in Exodus chapter 1, where it says in verse 8, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." So, okay, so we have a new king. And if you read, and I know history bores most people. I happen to adore history. I love history. I always have. But history bores most people. But history is important because it helps us to understand and explain things. And I'm talking about secular history. For instance, how did the city of Rome become the ascendant city on the Italian peninsula? Well, after the war, the Roman armies, the armies based out of the Rome, which was the tribe of the Latins, defeated Carthage. Then they had to fight what's called the social wars. They fought a war within the different tribes and against the different tribes on the Italian peninsula. And Rome came out on top, which is why the city of Rome became the dominant people, or the dominant tribe of the Italian peninsula. What most people know is the Roman Empire. Well, it's the Roman Empire because Rome, the tribe, the Latin tribe, which is based around Rome, won the war. Well, something similar is going on in Egypt. Egypt was a group of tribes. The land of Egypt, what we currently know as Egypt, was a bunch of little tribes who consolidated, and they warred with each other for supremacy. So when Joseph is welcomed into Pharaoh's court as the second most important person in all of Egypt, and Joseph's family, Israel and his children and grandchildren, make the sojourn to Egypt as welcome and honored guests, it's under one dynasty, maybe the Thebans. But then the Thebans are overthrown by the Heracleopians, something like that. Don't quote me that I said that correctly. It's I'm close. It was a different group, a different ethnic group, a different group of tribes that now took over and started a new dynasty. So it's in this swap over time between the dynasty and the group, the ethnic group that was appreciative of Joseph, that welcomed Joseph, that honored Joseph and his family, and the new tribe who comes in and wins the war. And so when the new tribe comes in and wins the war, they understand that the nation of Israel, the Hebrews, are going to be sympathetic to the previous dynasty. So if they have to continue fighting, they know that the Hebrews will support their enemies, the old dynasty. Does that make sense? As to why the Egyptians now suddenly enslaved the Hebrews. Because they were afraid that the Hebrews are going to support whoever that they kicked off the throne and took the throne for themselves, which does happen. A few hundred years later, another dynasty arises and kicks this dynasty out. So it's not like, my point being, it's not like the pharaohs of Egypt were just one continuous line from the same family group. No, there was still intertribal warfare. There was still different dynasties or different ethnic groups that would take the throne of Egypt at different times. And it was at one of those swap over times that the nation of Israel is placed into slavery. Does that make sense? So now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So he said, all right, we're going to have, these are an asset now. We're going to take them and we're going to enslave them, so we will own them, and we will use the nation of Israel to produce the things that we need. Also, very interestingly enough, in Egyptian history, you'll see there comes a time when the population outgrows the ability to provide for the population. So there is a necessity in Egyptian history for slavery to arise, so that they can work these people and open up new areas, specifically for foodstuffs, that the land would not support the amount of people. So they needed to open up new lands. They needed people to work those lands. So they enslaved the nation of Israel, among others. Let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Israel said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives, and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So even though they try to oppress them, even though they enslave them, even though they make their lives miserable, it turns out that the nation of Israel just prospers through that. And it seems like the birth rate even actually increases. So they're increasing more and more and more. And the nation of Israel is growing more and more and more. The Hebrews, they're not the nation of Israel yet. The Hebrews are growing more and more and more. So he says to the midwives, all right, if it's a boy, you better kill it, right? Do a partial birth abortion if you see it's a boy. But girls, you're going to let them live. And eventually the Hebrew nation would die out, because the Egyptians will take the Hebrew females as concubines or wives or whatever, but there would be no more males to perpetuate the Hebrew line. So they keep growing, and the current administration of Egypt is afraid of them, so they won't rid of them. So he instructs the Hebrew midwives to destroy them. They fear God rather than fear man, so they disobey Pharaoh, and God blesses them for that disobedience. Which we can have a discussion on civil disobedience and when it is appropriate for a Christian, but that's not for tonight. But sometimes it is appropriate for a Christian to disobey the governing authorities if it directly opposes the law of God. So we can have that discussion elsewhere. Then he moves on and says, okay, if the Hebrew midwives won't do it, I'll just open it up to all of my people. So he tells his people, all the Egyptians, you can throw baby boy Hebrews into the Nile. That's your command from your Pharaoh. If you see a baby Hebrew that's a boy, you throw him to the Nile and let the crocodiles eat him. Let something eat him, kill him. We want rid of these Hebrews. And this is where we pick up the story of the birth of Moses, that famous story that most of us know and most of us have read about in Sunday school, right? Moses' mother has a baby. It's a baby boy. And the command is to throw the boy babies into the river. So she technically obeys the law, but she does so in a manner that is designed to save her child. She creates an ark. She creates a boat with reeds and waterproofs it, puts her baby boy in the boat after 3 months. That's as long as she can hide him. She puts him in the boat and she casts him, in essence, into the Nile. Now, she didn't walk down to the Nile and just toss the boat into the river. She just put him in the reeds on the edge of the Nile and set his sister, Miriam, we'll find out her name later, Miriam, to watch and see what happens to the baby boy who was in the ark. And the baby boy catches the attention of Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the place to bathe, and perhaps this is a thought out plan on Moses' mother's part. Maybe she knows that this is where Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe. This is probably a place where the security forces of Pharaoh has cleared of crocodiles. If you know something about the Nile, you know about the Nile crocodiles. It's full of crocodiles, right? Dangerous things are in the Nile. But apparently this is a place where they kept clear of crocodiles so that Pharaoh's daughter could feel safe when she comes to bathe. So perhaps for some way, somehow, Moses' mother knew that. And so that's where she chooses to toss her child into the Nile, where he would be safe, would not be eaten by crocodiles, and hopefully catch the eye and the heart of Pharaoh's daughter, which is what happens. Pharaoh's daughter sees this little boat and is curious about it. And she sends one of her servants over to get it out of the reeds. And when she opens the lid to this little boat or this ark, lo and behold, there's a crying baby. And like most women and a lot of men, it pulls at your heartstrings, right? So she's not going to throw this baby away. So she adopts this baby. She is going to keep this baby in defiance of her father's order. So she defies Pharaoh. And it turns out the rest of the Egyptians do the same. But this is where Miriam steps up and says, hey, you want me to call a Hebrew woman to come and nurse the baby for you? And Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, that would be great. So Miriam runs back and gets Moses' very own mother. And so Moses' mother is the wet nurse. She raises Moses until he's been weaned. So God graciously allows her to raise Moses. And it's not just God being gracious, it's God being strategic, because during that time, his mother tells Moses the stories of his ancestors, the stories of his people, of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. Moses knows about the God of the Hebrews, and he knows that he is one of the Hebrews. He knows who he belongs to. He's from the tribe of Levi. He's a direct descendant of Israel's son, Levi. And then he moves into the palace. When he is weaned, and at whatever age, I'm not sure, he's still a young boy, he moves into the palace of Pharaoh to be Pharaoh's grandson. So that's what he is, Pharaoh's adopted grandson, which God is placing him there. Even at the very beginning, God is preparing this man to be the deliverer, to be the one who brings deliverance to the nation of Israel many, many, many years later, because he grows up in the house of Pharaoh, and just like any of Pharaoh's grandchildren, he would have been given the best of education in law, in religion, in the various means of statecraft. He would have been given the very best military education. He would eventually become a commander of a portion of Pharaoh's army. And he learned all of these things in the house of Pharaoh, the one who had chosen to destroy God's people, God is using that very person to train the Hebrew deliverer who will bring the nation of Israel out of their slavery. And then we see the story in chapter 3 or chapter 2 where Moses goes out to visit the Hebrew people, the Hebrew slaves. He knows he's a Hebrew, even though he is privileged to be Pharaoh's adopted grandson. He is still a Hebrew in his mind, and the author of Hebrews tells us that Moses preferred to be known with the Hebrews as opposed to the glories of Pharaoh's palace. Is when he's talking about Moses in the Hall of Faith. But why do I keep saying Abraham? It's been a long week, guys. Long week. But Moses, and Ellen, I see I got a new listener there in your lap. Moses sees a Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And chapter 2 tells us Moses looks this way and he looks that way. He looks all around, doesn't see anybody. So he kills the Egyptian for beating the Hebrew slave. Moses sees himself already as a deliverer. He's a young man. He's idealistic. He is identifying himself with his brethren, the Hebrews, rather than with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And so he tries to deliver in his own power, in his own might, the nation of Israel. And he starts by killing a Egyptian guard. And he takes him into the desert and buries him in the sand. And then he goes back to Pharaoh's house. And Moses, in his mind, I'm sure thinks, hey, this is a good thing. This is a start. We can cause an uprising, and we can overthrow Pharaoh. We can free ourselves from Pharaoh. I'm going to be the leader of the Hebrews. I'm going to free the Hebrews. And he goes out the next day and he sees two Hebrews arguing. Two Jews arguing with one another, coming to blows. And Moses tries to intervene and say, hey, why are you hitting your brother? And the Hebrew response to Moses said, who made you Lord and judge over us? Are you going to kill me the same way you killed the Egyptian? And so it has become known what Moses has done. So now Moses has to flee from Egypt, because as soon as Pharaoh hears it, which is what happened, Pharaoh puts a death sentence on Moses. He's going to put Moses to death for killing an Egyptian guard simply for the fact that the Egyptian guard was beating a Hebrew slave. So Moses has to flee Pharaoh, and he flees to Midian. And just like so many of the patriarchs, Moses meets his wife at a well. We have Jethro's daughters, 7 daughters. They come to draw water at the well. Moses is in Midian. He has fled from Pharaoh, and he's at the well. And here comes Jethro's 7 daughters, and they draw water, and some shepherds come, and they run them off. And Moses steps up and rebukes the shepherds and chases the shepherds off. And Jethro's daughters are able to water their sheep, and they make it back home sooner than Jethro expects. And they go back, and Jethro says, hey, why are you home so early? And they tell the story about this man who ran the shepherds off so that they could water the flock. And Jethro says, go back and get him. Bring him here so we can eat. And the text says that Moses was pleased to stay with Jethro. Moses finds a job, in other words. Moses finds a job with Jethro, who's a priest of Midian, but also owns flocks. So Moses goes from the palace to being a shepherd in the desert, in the wilderness. So Moses spends the next 40 years shepherding his father's flock. He marries Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and they have a son. And then we see what we're going to read in next and what we're going to concentrate. I know this has been going fast, but all of this stuff is setting up and telling the brief story of Moses. And if you don't believe me, we're just at the end of chapter 2. All of that stuff is in the first 2 chapters. So now we get to chapter 3. Chapter 3, a very, very important chapter for us all to understand. Now Moses, in verse 1, was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. We will know this mountain later as Mount Sinai, where the law was given. Right? Moses comes to the Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, same mountain. It's that name is interchangeable. And the angel of the Lord appeared. Now, we have talked about the angel of the Lord. When it's followed by the definite article, the, it's talking about Jesus. It's a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay? This is very important because people will say, well, you know, Jesus never claimed to be God, or the Old Testament never says that Jesus is God. Right? Listen to the words carefully. Words matter. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, that bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Now, verse 4. Who's in the bush? Number one, who's in the bush? The angel of the Lord, right? The angel of the Lord is in the bush. That's what it just says, right? Verse 4, when the Lord, and you notice it's all capitalized, so it's when Yahweh or Jehovah, when Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. Who's in the bush? God. Who's in the bush? Chapter 10, verse 2, the angel of the Lord. So the angel of the Lord is God, right? Isn't that what this passage just says? The angel of the Lord who appeared to Abraham, the angel of the Lord who wrestled with Jacob, the angel of the Lord is God. The angel of the Lord is in the bush. God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And then the one who was in the bush, the angel of the Lord, and Yahweh said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So we have our beginning understanding of the Trinity. It's being fleshed out as we go through the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord is the same as God the Father. The angel of the Lord is the same as Yahweh, right? So that helps explain Genesis when it says, let us make man in our image, right? They're both God. The angel of the Lord is God. God is the angel of the Lord. Then the Lord said, again, then Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of Egypt. That's a very important statement, because God just said, I've come down. I've come down, and I've come to this bush as the angel of the Lord. God come down to his people to deliver his people. That's a precursor, that's a shadow, that's a type, that's a prophetic utterance that eventually God himself will again come down to deliver his people. Well, we know that happens with Christ, where he takes on the form of a man, the flesh of a man, comes down to deliver his people. Well, here's a pre-runner of that. He has heard his people suffering. He knows they're suffering, and they are suffering terrible affliction at the hands of their enemy, the Egyptians in this case, Satan in our case, as we're going to see Sunday. And God himself says, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And then we have the first of Moses' objections. And this is an interesting study, because we oftentimes also have the very same objections as Moses. Unreasonable objections, it seems. When God tells us to do something, when God prompts us to do something, we oftentimes argue with God and talk ourselves out of obedience that we should be indulging in. Look at verse 11. But Moses said to God, right? He just spoke to God. He knows he's speaking to God. He's standing there looking at a bush that refuses to be burned up, and this flame out of the bush is speaking to him. And Moses is so terrified he hides his face. Moses knows very well who he's speaking with, because God had just told him, I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I'm the God that your mother told you about, Moses. I'm the God that you have known about all of your life. I'm the God, when you studied comparative world religions in Pharaoh's University, I'm the God of the Hebrews. I'm the God of Joseph. I'm the God of your people. And Moses' first response, first answer to God, or first words to God after God gives him a command, says, Moses, you're going to go to Egypt and you're going to free your people. You wanted to do it all those years ago when you beat the Egyptian to death. Now you're going to do it in my power and in my way. You couldn't do it in your own power and your own way, but I'm going to use you to do it in my power and my way. And Moses' first initial response is, but who am I? But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? His first response, and the response that many of us have when God tells us to do something, and I have to admit, my first response when I felt the call to go into the ministry was, well, who am I? I'm not a preacher. I'm not a pastor. But who am I? But it doesn't matter who I am. And that's God's point. Moses says, who am I? And God, in essence, says it doesn't matter who you are. He said in verse 12, but I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, right? Where Moses goes up and communes with God face to face. And then we got to the second objection of Moses. Verse 13, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. That's a funny statement. I am who I am. That means I'm the self-existent one. I'm the eternal one. I'm the uncreated one. All of that is wrapped up in I am who I am. I am the self-existent God. I need nothing outside of myself to be who I am. And he said, he being God, say this to the people of Israel, I am, or Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, has sent me to you. Remember the tetragrammaton is, there's no vowels in Hebrew, so we only have the consonants. So there, we really don't know how to pronounce whatever word God spoke to Moses. So the best we can come up with in English is either Jehovah or Yahweh, because we have to insert vowels in the Hebrew letters. Am I getting too in depth there? Probably. So he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, as the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. Thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what you've done and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And after that he will let you go, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. And you would think that Moses' objections would stop there, wouldn't you? God has given him this big long soliloquy about what's going to happen. He's God. He's proven he's God. And he's going to make all of these things happen. Even God has graciously answered Moses' objections. And you would think that Moses would simply bow his head and say, yes, Lord. I will do what you're commanding me to do. But Moses is stubborn, just like the rest of us. So the objections keep coming, and we do have time to get through chapter 4 tonight. So here's the next objection from Moses. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you." So he said, okay, I'm going to bring this fantastic tale to these people that I spoke to a burning bush, and they're supposed to just believe that I'm not crazy, that you actually have spoken to me. And so God says, okay. The Lord said to him, "What is that in your staff?" He said, "What is that in your hand?" And he said, "A staff." Shepherd walking stick, big old walking stick. And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again, the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. They would not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign. They may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even those two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So God has just allowed Moses to do two miracles. He's allowed him to turn his walking stick into a snake and back into a walking stick. He caused Moses' hand to turn leprous and then be instantly healed from leprosy. And so you would think, okay, that seals the deal for Moses. He's going to obey now. But that's not exactly what happens with Moses. Even God giving him these visual signs, Moses still comes up with an excuse. But Moses said to the Lord in verse 10, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." So he uses an excuse. If you look at Stephen's sermon right before he's stoned to death in Acts chapter 7, you'll see that Moses is being overly humble here, because he said, "Lord, I was never able to speak. I've never been able to speak, even in the past. I couldn't speak back then when I was in Pharaoh's house, but that's not really true." Moses just, excuse me, Moses just does not want to obey God because he's afraid to go back to Egypt. But God says, "Who makes a man's mouth? You say you can't speak, but who makes the man's mouth? I make a man's mouth, and I will make your mouth say what I want it to say." You're not going in your own power. In other words, Moses, you're my mouthpiece, and I will speak through you. Verse 13, but he being Moses, but he said, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else. Please send someone else. Don't use me. I don't want to be used by you. I don't want to get involved in this." Verse 14, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff, with which you shall do signs." And so God has answered every one of Moses' objections. Finally, he answers him out of his anger and said, "All right, fine. If you're not going to do it by yourself, you're not going to get the glory by yourself. Look, you got a brother. I know he can speak, and I'm going to teach you both what to say, but he'll be your mouthpiece." So there, you have no more excuses, Moses. And in verse 18, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife, his sons, and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I had put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. So here we have a promise of what's going to happen at the Passover night. God says, ultimately, if you're not going to let my son Israel go, my firstborn Israel, then I'm going to kill your firstborn son, Pharaoh. So we can't say that Pharaoh didn't have any warning beforehand. God has told him at the very beginning, this is what's going to happen. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. That's a strange inserted verse in verse 24. Why is God seeking to put Moses to death? And it all boils down to obedience. God has chosen Moses to be his mouthpiece. God has chosen Moses to lead his people. And Moses has failed to obey the command that God gave to Abraham. To all the Hebrew children, all the male Hebrew children must be circumcised. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. So this is an important lesson that God is teaching Moses. Look, you need obedience. You argue with me there in the desert in the burning bush when I told you who I am and who you believed of what I said, and then you went home and failed to do what I commanded all of the Hebrew children to do through Abraham, that you must circumcise your sons to set them apart for me. So this is God teaching Moses the importance of obedience, which we'll see play out later in Moses' life. Verse 27, the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed, and they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, that he had seen their affliction. They bowed their heads and worshipped. Then we will start looking next week at the lead up to the plagues, and then briefly go through the plagues, because we went through the plagues in Sunday school not too long ago. I know Chris took us through the plagues, but we will talk about them, but not that extensively moving forward. So that's the beginning of the book of Exodus, which ultimately I said is a book of redemption, and it is the birth of the nation of Israel. So any questions, comments, and concerns?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, going back to verse 22.
Of what
Chapter
chapter?
4. Chapter 4.
Okay.
If Jesus is God's only son, what does he mean when he says Israel is his firstborn son?
That's not to be taken literally. It's a cultural thing. He's telling Pharaoh the importance that the nation of Israel has to him. He equates the nation of Israel as his son, right? Not in the same manner that that the Son of God is begotten or is declared the Son. It's just the same. It's the same language that he uses about us. We have become children of God. Right now, I was born from Glenn and Lyndall Hyder, but I'm a child of God. And so God is using this figurative language to show the importance that the nation of Israel chooses for him, and that they are the first nation, the firstborn nation that he chose for himself. Right? So he chose Israel, or he chose the nation of Israel through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, whose name he changes to Israel, to be his very special people. And that's the language that God uses to impress upon Pharaoh the nature of the nation of Israel and how they are to relate to God, or how God relates to them. Does that help, or does that confuse matters?
It helps, but I have another question also.
I got another answer. It might be no, I don't know, but I've got one.
Where going back to the burning bush and the angel of the Lord, you
Yeah.
said the angel of the Lord is Jesus. So this is the first time he came to earth and stayed,
No.
or
Well,
because God was with Moses through the whole thing. So
the whole Exodus.
I'm kind of confused.
Well, okay, we have what's called pre-incarnate. Incarnate means the birth of Christ, the enfleshment of Christ, right? When Christ is born in the manger. That's the incarnation. So a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ is when the Son, the second person of the Trinity, comes to earth to do something. He meets with Abraham there when he goes to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He sits with Abraham and shares a meal with Abraham, right? He appears to Adam and Eve when he walks in the garden. All of those appearances of the angel of the Lord is the second person of the Trinity, right? This time, the language that it was used there at the bush, I have come down to redeem the people, to bring the people out of the nation of Egypt. And he stays with the people through the entire Exodus, right? He comes down and he dwells in the tabernacle. He's a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. All of those things, the God who walks with the nation of Israel through the wilderness is the second person of the Trinity. And we see the Trinity throughout the Exodus because the second person of the Trinity, God's presence is there in the tabernacle, while at the same time, God is still in heaven. And we see that taught through the book of Exodus, which we will see. So that tells us that, right, this is the second person of the Trinity. And we see that Jesus, when we couple that with the Gospel of John and what John teaches us about the nature of creation, vis-a-vis Jesus, right? He says there was nothing created that wasn't created through him being Christ, being the second person of the Trinity. And Jesus and God, and John says, in the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And the Logos means the very expression of, right? Paul tells us that he is the exact representation of the nature of God. So we see that the Old Testament is consistent with our understanding of Christ, that when there is a creative act, when there is an act whereby God is interacting with his creation, that it is the second person of the Trinity that does that. The Holy Spirit takes up residence within us and interacts with us spiritually. But when it's a physical interaction, it's the second person of the Trinity. And that probably begs a deeper study, which we can certainly do. But yeah, he comes down and he stays through the Exodus. And then we see later he appears to Joshua there at Jericho. We see further appearances by him until we get to the incarnation when he puts on human flesh.
Okay, that makes so much more sense though. So let me get this straight. So we know that Jesus was always around. He's been around since the beginning of time.
Correct.
And in the Old Testament, before his physical birth, he just kind of appears
Periodically.
but doesn't really have a name other than God.
The angel of the Lord is what he's typically called. But yeah, God as well. Those are interchangeable.
Okay, I think I got that. All right.
And we that's a hard thing for people to get their mind about, that he's the Son, which implies that he is created, right? Implies he has a beginning. But then we read in the Psalm, the psalmist says, and he's speaking for God, right? The Holy Spirit has inspired him to speak it this way. And he says, and God speaking to the Son, God the Father speaking to the Son, today I have begotten you. In other words, I have declared you the Son. It's a positional thing that Jesus has taken. the place of the Son. He's not inferior to the Father, neither is the Spirit inferior to the Father, but they have submitted themselves to the will of the Father. So it's a positional thing in the Trinity. The triune God has taken on separate roles, even though they are all completely God. The Trinity is a very difficult thing, but it's when we say the only begotten Son of God, we're not saying that he's the only born Son of God. We're saying he's the declared Son of God, the only declared Son of God. But it's a positional thing, not a creation thing, if that makes sense.
It did. I think I actually followed and understood that.
Well, I might be getting better then.